Episode 9, The Role of the Settlor After Settlement. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Fallen, and welcome to Trusts Unpacked, where we strip away myth and marketing and explain in plain terms how trusts actually work in real family situations. For the last 20 years, my fiduciary work has focused almost entirely on the architecture of trusts, the skill of trusteeship, and the challenge of long-term family governance, not as a technical exercise, but as a human one. In doing so, I've had the privilege to advise hundreds of families, as well as institutions and advisors across the world. Alongside my advisory work, I'm a published author. I've recently completed a trilogy that reflects both the technical and the human dimensions of both the fiduciary and private banking fields. But before we begin, a brief but important note. This podcast is provided for general information and discussion only. It does not constitute legal, tax, fiduciary, or professional advice, and it should not be relied upon as such. As ever, you should always seek advice from appropriately qualified professionals in your relevant jurisdiction before making decisions or taking action. So let's begin this episode, our third in the group looking at human roles within the trust, and take a closer look at the settlor, the person who usually matters most at the beginning. This session addresses a question that's rarely asked directly, but is always present beneath the surface. What happens after the assets have been settled? Many of the most serious problems in trust planning don't arise at creation. They arise later, in the space between formal divestment and informal behaviour. And this session is about navigating that space honestly, sustainably, and lawfully. So let's start with a really important question. What does settlement actually mean? Settlement's not symbolic, it's not provisional, and it's not reversible at will. When assets are settled into trust, ownership changes. The trustee becomes the legal owner, and the settlor steps back. That step back is not just a technical inconvenience. It's the price of the trust's effectiveness. It's what makes that price necessary. It's simple. A trust only works if the separation is credible, not merely documented, but visible. The law doesn't test intention. It tests behavior. If ownership appears unchanged in practice, courts will treat it as unchanged in substance. This is particularly important because trusts are often examined years after creation. At that point, memories are irrelevant. What matters is evidence, emails, minutes, decision trails, patterns of conduct. A trust that cannot withstand that examination was never truly settled. You see, most settlors understand settlement, at least intellectually. Emotionally, however, the adjustment takes time. Difficulties arise when the mind accepts the structure, but behavior does not follow. The law doesn't care what the settlor intended to do emotionally. It cares what they actually did, behaviorally. Courts, regulators, and tax authorities examine patterns of conduct. Who made decisions? Who initiated transactions? Who was deferred to? Who behaved as owner? If the settlor continues to act as owner, the trust does not fail instantly. It simply degrades. It becomes hollow. On paper, it exists. In substance, it does not. This distinction matters more than most people realize. Trust law is not sentimental, it's pragmatic. It asks a simple question: who was really in control? So why do settlors struggle to let go? Because it's fashionable to criticize settlors who remain involved. That criticism is, however, often lazy. Settlors usually want to remain involved for sensible reasons. They know the assets, they understand the operating risks, they understand the family, and they carry the original intent. So stepping away entirely can feel irresponsible. For many founders, particularly first-generation wealth creators. Stepping back feels like abandonment rather than stewardship. But there's also a deeper reason why they may not be able to let go. It's that wealth is not just economic capital, it's psychological capital as well. It represents competence, control over uncertainty, in fact, their very identity. Asking a settlor to relinquish ownership of something they created is also asking them to relinquish a role that they may have occupied for decades. Trust law doesn't deny this human reality, but it does impose a boundary. Influence is permitted, control is not. The mistake is assuming that good intentions are enough to manage that boundary. They are not. Only structure and discipline do that. So what's the legal boundary between influence and control? Law's position is clear, even if its application is subtle. A settlor may explain intentions, provide context, express preferences, articulate values, and influence trustee thinking. But the settlor may not give directions that are followed as a matter of course, retain an informal veto power, expect trustees to seek approval, or treat trust assets as still theirs. So the difference isn't tone, it's outcome. If trustees genuinely exercise independent judgment, influence is legitimate. If trustees consistently defer, influence has become control. This is why many trust failures are not discovered until something goes wrong. Whilst markets are rising and relationships are harmonious, informal control looks benign. It's only under stress that the reality is tested. A large distribution request, a creditor challenge, a divorce, a tax inquiry. At that point, historical behaviour is examined closely. Patterns matter more than paperwork. It's also important to understand that the settlor is not the only audience. Many settlors think about influence solely in terms of their relationship with trustees and beneficiaries. That is a mistake. Trust behavior is often examined later by people who were never part of the original conversation. Tax authorities, regulators, courts, creditors, divorcing spouses, future beneficiaries. These parties don't care how reasonable the settlor felt their involvement was. They look for evidence, emails, meeting minutes, patterns of instruction, who initiated decisions, who was deferred to. Influence that feels benign internally can look decisive externally. This is particularly important because scrutiny is usually retrospective. At the time decisions are made, no one expects challenge. Years later, when circumstances have changed, those same decisions are reinterpreted. Settlor involvement that may have felt collaborative may later be characterized as domination. Trustee accommodation may be reframed as abdication. This isn't cynical, it's structural. Third parties reconstruct intent from behavior, not from memory. Settlors who understand this tend to moderate their involvement early. Those who do not often leave trustees exposed later, despite having acted in good faith. So let's look at some legitimate mechanisms for settlor influence. Because well-designed trusts recognize the settlor's ongoing relevance and provide structured channels for influence. The first of these is influence through design. The most powerful influence a settlor ever exercises is exercised before settlement, through trustee selection, beneficiary definition, scope of discretion, governance mechanisms, and power allocation. A trust deed is, after all, a map of intent. A well-designed deed reduces the need for later intervention. A poorly designed one forces it. So many settlor problems are actually drafting problems in disguise. There's also an underappreciated distinction between expressing influence and embedding influence. Expressed influence is episodic, a conversation, a letter of wishes, a meeting where context is explained. Embedded influence is structural. Powers that must be consulted, approval rights exercised routinely, informal expectations that trustees, well, check first. The former is usually safe, the latter is always dangerous. Embedding influence creates dependency. Trustees begin to calibrate decisions around anticipated settlor reaction. And over time, they stop testing alternatives. This is one reason why settlor committees, informal advisory boards dominated by the settlor, or shadow governance arrangements are so risky. They blur responsibility. While things go well, they feel efficient. When things go wrong, accountability evaporates. The law insists on knowing who decided. Any structure that makes that unclear invites challenge. The second method is letters of wishes, because these are the most common and indeed the most misunderstood influence tool. Used well, they're invaluable. They allow the settlor to explain values, priorities, family dynamics, concerns, and long-term intent. In other words, they guide judgment without dictating outcomes. Used badly, however, they destroy discretion. Overly detailed letters that read like instructions, letters updated constantly in response to events. At that point, trustees stop thinking and start complying. A good letter of wishes ages well, is principle-based, and leaves room for judgment. A bad one demands perpetual relevance. The third method is reserved powers, because in some jurisdictions, settlors may retain limited reserved powers. These can include appointing or removing trustees, approving extraordinary transactions, or giving consent to structural changes. Reserved powers are not inherently dangerous, but they are cumulative. Each additional power retained makes the trust harder to defend. The guiding principle must therefore be restraint. Reserved powers should be narrow, rarely exercised, and transparent. If they're used routinely, the trust is already compromised. So, what do we need to watch out for? In other words, how can influence become control? Very few settlors intend to undermine their own trust. Erosion is gradual. A suggestion becomes an expectation, and an expectation becomes habit, and habit becomes entitlement. Trustees begin to ask for approval out of courtesy. Settlors begin to give it to be helpful. Soon, no one remembers who's actually deciding. This creates severe risk. The trust's validity is questioned. Asset protection weakens. Tax treatment becomes vulnerable. Trustees become personally exposed. Courts don't look at one-off events. They look at patterns. If trustees always do what the settlor wants, the conclusion is straightforward. The most damaging effects of settlor overreach are often not legal. They're generational. Children and grandchildren observe how the trust really works. They notice who decisions are attributed to. They learn where authority truly sits. If they see that trustees defer to the settlor, they internalize a lesson, and that is that the trust is provisional. Authority is personal. Rules. This lesson persists long after the settlor is gone. Future trustees struggle to establish authority. Beneficiaries expect negotiation rather than governance. Disappointment becomes personalized rather than institutional. By contrast, where settlors respect trustee independence early, a different lesson is learned, that the trust has a life of its own, that authority is procedural, not personal, that outcomes flow from process. This difference is profound. It determines whether the trust becomes an institution or simply a family argument frozen in legal form. Settlor behavior in the early years sets this trajectory. No drafting can undo it later. So, this can put a trustee in an impossible position. And let's look at that position. Because trustees caught under informal settlor control occupy one of the most dangerous positions in trust law. They retain legal responsibility, but lose practical independence. They're expected to decide, but discouraged from disagreeing. Experienced trustees recognize this early and push back. Inexperienced ones often don't. This is a common source of trustee resignation. It's also a common source of litigation. The law doesn't accept the "I was only following wishes" statement as a defense. Trustees must either exercise judgment or step aside. Healthy trusts require trustees who can disappoint the settlor occasionally. If that feels impossible, the structure is already broken. Part 7. Let's look at the psychology of letting go. Because letting go of assets isn't just legal, it's also deeply psychological. Settlors who struggle most often used the trust as a compromise, a way of giving up ownership without fully accepting the consequences. That compromise rarely holds. Trusts work best when the settlor has genuinely moved on, not disappeared, not disengaged, but stepped back. Influence should be occasional, principled, and bounded, not constant, not reactive, not personalized. The settlor who allows the trust to operate independently strengthens it. The settlor who cannot resist intervention weakens it. There's also a developmental aspect to this transition that is rarely acknowledged. Many founders experience a loss of relevance after settlement. They're no longer the decision maker. They are no longer the ultimate authority. Their role changes from actor to observer, and this can feel destabilizing. Some respond by increasing involvement, often unconsciously. They attend more meetings, they offer more helpful suggestions, they become more emotionally invested in outcomes. It isn't about ego, it's about adjustment. Trust structures that recognize this phase explicitly tend to manage it better. Clear boundaries, defined channels for influence, scheduled rather than reactive engagement. Where these are absent, the settlor's need for relevance often expresses itself as control. The irony is that this behavior usually undermines the settlor's legacy. Rather than being remembered as a steward who built something durable, they become remembered as someone who never quite let go. And that is not how most settlors wish to be remembered. Let me give you an example of what happens when persistence is applied to building wealth, but not to securing its future. This is from my book, Trust. I once worked with a German industrial founder who embodied endurance. Born before the First World War, he survived deprivation, served through the Second World War, and returned to a country quite literally reduced to ash. With no capital, no safety net, and no audience, he rebuilt a manufacturing business from scrap, day after day, machine by machine, recording every pfennig in a notebook. Persistence was not a philosophy for him, it was survival. Over decades, the company grew into a highly respected Mittelstand manufacturer, private, profitable, technically excellent. By the time I met him, he was in his late 70s, widely admired and deeply tired. The question was no longer whether he could build something, but whether it could survive him. The warning signs were clear: 3 children, deeply unequal capability, unspoken resentment, a son groomed as heir without the temperament to lead, daughters marginalized, each in different ways. The family functioned because the founder still occupied the center. Once that center weakened, collapse was inevitable. I recommended a fiduciary structure, not to punish anyone, not to take control, but to hold the business through transition, impose governance, and buy time for reality to assert itself. The solution required resolve. It required the founder to accept discomfort now, to avoid catastrophe later. That's where his persistence failed. The family resisted. The son felt entitled. The daughters were anxious but unheard. The founder hesitated. He chose compromise over clarity. A hybrid structure was adopted. External management layered onto inherited authority. Ownership passed before capability was proven. The appearance of continuity was preserved. The substance was not. From a settlor's perspective, the decision felt humane. From a governance perspective, it was fatal. As his health declined, authority fragmented, decisions slowed, customers drifted, risk accumulated. In fact, in a final desperate act, the founder's wife mortgaged the family farm to save the company, without oversight and without advice. Capital was lost. The company borrowed. Within 5 years, everything was gone. The business, the home, the legacy. Not because the founder lacked persistence, but because he applied it selectively. He endured hardship, but did not endure conflict. He rebuilt machines, but did not build governance. And this is the uncomfortable truth that this episode exists to confront. Settlor influence does not end with settlement. It ends when the hard decisions are completed, when structure replaces personality, when persistence is applied not just to building wealth, but to protect you from family reality. Doing nothing feels kind, but it rarely is. Persistence in this context is not about holding on. It's about seeing something through to its conclusion, even when the final steps are most difficult. Trusts fail less often through interference than through unfinished thinking, and unfinished thinking is usually a failure of persistence, not intention. That is the lesson. So let's look at how settlor behavior ages over time. Early behavior sets culture. If trustees defer early, that habit persists. If beneficiaries see the settlor as the real decision maker, expectations follow, even after the settlor's death. Excessive settlor involvement often undermines the very goals that motivated the trust. Asset protection weakens, discipline erodes, governance becomes performative. The most successful settlors are often the least visible. They design carefully, they explain intent, then they allow time. It's worth pausing now to consider what good settlor behavior looks like over decades, not months, not years, but decades. Good settlors reduce involvement gradually, not abruptly, allow trustees to make visible decisions, accept outcomes that they would not have chosen themselves, resist the urge to intervene during moments of discomfort, and focus on values rather than the outcomes. They use influence sparingly. They understand that silence can be powerful. They also plan for their absence. They help trustees prepare for a time when their guidance is no longer available and their personal authority no longer carries weight. This, in fact, is one of the most generous acts a settlor can perform. It shifts the trust from founder-led to institution-led governance. That transition is a real test of success. Trusts that survive it thrive. Trusts that do not often fracture. So as advisors, we have a duty to speak plainly, because advisors play a decisive role here and often fail, not through ignorance, but through avoidance. A settlor who cannot step back should be told so, not harshly, but clearly. A trust isn't a halfway house between ownership and control. It's a deliberate transfer of authority. Advisors who collude in ambiguity create future disputes. Advisors who insist on clarity reduce risk dramatically. There is one scenario that deserves explicit attention because it appears far more often than anyone admits. On paper, the settlor has stepped back, the trust has been settled, trustees have been appointed, minutes are taken, advice is received, and forms are filed. In practice, nothing has changed. The settlor still decides, trustees still defer. The structure exists, but authority has not moved. This situation is rarely created deliberately. It emerges from comfort, long-standing habits, mutual reassurance, a desire to avoid friction. The settlor says, well, I'm only advising. The trustee says, I'm only listening. And yet decisions continue to flow in one direction. This is the most dangerous configuration a trust can enter, not because it looks wrong, but because it looks reasonable. Trustees feel protected by formality. Settlors feel protected by intent. Both are mistaken. Courts do not examine labels. They examine substance. They ask who decided, who influenced, and who bore risk. Where settlor and trustee behaviour collapses into a single decision-making unit, the trust loses its credibility entirely. Not instantly, but inexorably. This is particularly common where the settlor is technically skilled, an experienced investor, a business founder, someone who genuinely knows more than the trustee about the assets. Trustees in this position often tell themselves that deferring is prudent. Why override expertise? Why slow decisions? Why create tension where alignment exists? The problem is that alignment is not independence. Trustees are appointed precisely to exercise judgment that is separate. When that separation disappears, the trust becomes performative. The most telling sign of this condition is language. If trustees say, we need to check with the settlor, and if settlors say, just do it this way, if meetings end with, so we are agreed, then independence has already eroded. At that point, it's not enough to adjust behavior. Structure must change. Either the settlor must genuinely step back, or the trustees must genuinely step aside. Anything else is an attempt to preserve appearances. One of the least understood aspects of the settlor's role after settlement is silence. Settlors often assume that responsible behavior requires constant engagement. That absence looks like neglect, that reduced involvement signals disinterest. In fact, the opposite is quite often true. Silence is one of the most powerful tools a settlor has once the trust is in place. Silence allows trustees to think, to deliberate, to disagree with one another, to reach decisions that are not calibrated to the settlor's reaction. Silence forces trustees to own outcomes. This is uncomfortable for everyone at force. Trustees worry that they're being abandoned. Settlors worry that they are losing relevance. Both misinterpret the transition, however. In reality, silence is not withdrawal, it's restraint. The settlor who speaks less often is not less influential. They're in fact more credible when they do speak. The settlor who comments on every decision teaches trustees to wait. The settlor who intervenes only occasionally teaches trustees to decide. Over time, this difference compounds. Trusts where the settlor is constantly present tend to drift towards informal governance. Trusts where the settlor is selectively present tend to institutionalize. It's not about frequency, it's about predictability. Trustees should know when settlor input is expected and when it is not. Ad hoc involvement is corrosive. Structured engagement is stabilizing. This is why scheduled reviews are so effective. Annual meetings, periodic lessons, formal channels. They create rhythm, and rhythm creates independence. Most settlors think about trusts in relation to their children. Very few think far enough ahead. Trusts rarely fail in the first generation. They fail in the second or third, when memory fades, when authority fragments, when behavior hardens into entitlement. At that point, the settlor is no longer present, but their behavior still is. Future beneficiaries do not know what the settlor intended emotionally. They know what the trust allowed structurally. They inherit patterns. If the settlor treated trustees as advisors, beneficiaries will too. If the settlor negotiated outcomes, beneficiaries will expect negotiation. If the settlor bypassed governance when inconvenient, beneficiaries will test it constantly. In this sense, the settlor is writing a manual for people they will never meet, and that is a sobering responsibility. The most effective settlors understand that their real audience is not the trustee sitting across the table today. It's the grandchild who will challenge the decision 30 years from now. That grandchild will ask, who decided before? How disagreement was handled, whether discretion was real or cosmetic. And the answers will be found in behavior, not in drafting. Settlors who internalize this tend to become less involved, not more. They stop solving problems personally. They start reinforcing process. They accept outcomes they dislike in order to preserve authority they value. That's not self-denial. It is, in fact, foresight. But let's be honest about the consequences when the settlor does not. When settlors fail to step back, several things tend to happen in sequence. Firstly, trustees become cautious, not cautious in the sense of careful, cautious in the sense of deferential. They avoid disagreement, they anticipate preferences, they stop proposing alternatives. Second, beneficiaries become confused, they receive mixed signals. Trustees speak of discretion, settlors speak of expectation, authority becomes ambiguous. Third, advisors become conflicted. They're pulled between formal governance and informal reality. Some accommodate, some withdraw. Very few confront directly. Finally, when stress arrives, the structure collapses. Stress may come from outside, a creditor, a regulator, a court, or it may come from inside, divorce, illness, or death. And at that point, the informal system is examined formally, and it rarely survives the transition. This is why settlor restraint is not just good practice, it's defensive architecture. There is, however, a myth that abounds in the trust world, and that is the myth of the benevolent controller. Because many settlors tell themselves a comforting story that their continued involvement is benign, that they're protecting the family, that they're smoothing outcomes, that without them, things would fall apart. Sometimes that is true, albeit temporarily, but benevolence does not legitimize control. The law does not recognize benevolent domination as a category, nor do beneficiaries once circumstances change. The settlor who controls out of kindness teaches the lesson that it is hard to reverse. That power lies with personality, not with structure. Once that lesson is learned, it is repeated by children, by advisors, by future trustees. And when the settlor is gone, the vacuum is destabilizing. Trusts do not fail because the benevolent controller was wrong. They fail because the system was never allowed to mature. So let's draw down on what good settlors do and what they do differently. After decades of observing trusts that endure and trusts that fracture, certain patterns are clear to me. Effective settlors do not disappear, but they do change posture. They ask fewer questions, but better ones. They stop asking, what should we do? And they start asking, how will this decision look when I'm no longer here? They don't insist on outcomes, they insist on process. They resist the temptation to rescue the trust from discomfort. They allow trustees to experience tension, disagreement, and uncertainty. They understand that trusteeship is a skill, and that skills develop only when exercised. They also plan for moments of weakness, illness, fatigue, cognitive decline. They ensure that their influence diminishes before their capacity does. And this is one of the least discussed and most important acts of stewardship. So let's talk about that settlor's final act of discipline. Because there's a final decision that every settlor makes, whether consciously or not, whether to complete the transition. Some settlors spend years building the structure but never quite finish the job. They leave edges unresolved, powers half relinquished, influence ambiguously placed. Others accept a harder truth, that the trust will never fully work until they no longer sit at its center. Those settlors complete the transition deliberately. They clarify roles, they reduce intervention, they accept being surprised by trustee decisions. And they live with that discomfort long enough for the trust to stabilize without them. It's not abdication, it's completion. And it's also very rare. But where it occurs, trusts tend to endure without drama, without constant repair. That is usually the settlor's true objective, even if it takes time to recognize it. You see, it's easy to describe what settlors should not do. It's harder and more useful to describe what success actually looks like in practice. When settlors get this transition right, the change is often almost unnoticed. There's no dramatic moment of withdrawal, no declaration of distance. What changes is texture rather than structure. Trustees begin to speak more freely. They debate amongst themselves without looking towards the settlor for confirmation. They bring proposals rather than options pre-filtered for approval. Decisions take slightly longer, but they are better owned. Beneficiaries notice something as well. They stop framing requests as appeals to the settlor's generosity and start engaging with the trust as a system. Language shift. Expectations recalibrate. Disappointment, when it comes, is directed at outcomes rather than people. The settlor remains present, but differently, less operational, more reflective. They ask how trustees reached a conclusion, not whether it aligns with what they would have chosen. They show interest in reasoning rather than results. This posture has a surprising effect. Trustees become more confident, not because they feel supported, but because they feel trusted. Confidence allows responsibility when responsibility is real. Over time, the settlor's influence becomes less visible but more durable. When they do speak, it carries weight precisely because it is not constant. Trustees listen more carefully, not out of obligation, but out of respect. This is the paradox that many settlors struggle to accept. Authority that is exercised less often tends to last. There's also an important emotional dimension to this stage. Settlors who step back successfully often describe a sense of relief. Not immediately. The first phase is, in fact, usually discomfort, a feeling of being unnecessary, a fear of irrelevance. But that passes. What replaces it is something closer to perspective, the ability to observe family dynamics without needing to intervene, the freedom to see trustees make mistakes and recover, the realization that the structure can carry weight without constant supervision. For settlors, this is the first time in decades that responsibility genuinely lifts, not in the sense of indifference, but in the sense of trust transferred. This is also where legacy starts to become tangible. The settlor sees that what endures is not the specific decisions they made, but the framework that allows decisions to be made without them. That realization is often deeply satisfying, even if it arrives almost unnoticed. It's worth being clear. Not every settlor reaches this point. Some remain engaged until the very end. Others disengage abruptly and leave confusion behind. But those who manage the transition deliberately tend to leave families that argue less, trustees that function better, and structures that survive stress. The outcome is not accidental. It is earned through restraint. And restraint in this context is not weakness. It's discipline applied at the right moment. The settlor who understands this does something rare. They finish. They do not just create a trust. They allow it to become real. So, the Cliff Notes version again. What have we learned from today's session? First, that settlement is real. Ownership changes, authority transfers. Second, that influence is permitted, but control is not, and that boundary is judged by patterns of conduct. Third, that most settlor overreach is not malicious, it's gradual. Fourth, that letters of wishes, reserved powers, and advisory roles can be legitimate, but only when exercised with restraint. Fifth, that trustees caught between legal responsibility and informal settlor control occupy a dangerous position. Following wishes is not a defense. Sixth, that settlor behavior teaches future generations how the trust really works. If governance is personal, beneficiaries learn to negotiate. If governance is procedural, beneficiaries learn to respect structure. Seventh, that silence can be constructive, Reduced intervention strengthens trustee confidence and institutional authority. Constant involvement delays maturity. Eighth, that persistence matters not only in building wealth, but in completing governance. Half-finished transitions are more dangerous than none at all. Ninth, that effective settlors change posture over time. They insist on process rather than outcomes. They accept decisions they might not have chosen themselves. And finally, that a trust is not designed to preserve the settlor's control. It's designed to allow authority to survive the settlor's absence. In short, the settlor's greatest contribution often comes after settlement, not before. It lies in allowing the structure to become real. That's a Settlors Unpacked. Join me in the next episode, the last in the group on human roles within the trust, to unpack beneficiaries, their rights, expectations, and the most common misunderstandings surrounding. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fell.